And now, without further ado, I'm delighted to be joined by C.Thi Nguyen, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Utah Valley University, I believe soon to be the University of Utah, and he's going to talk with me about games, public policy, and the pandemic. T, I thought that we might start by talking about your recent book on games, which I believe was slated to come out next week, but now is stuck on pallets somewhere in New York, and it's being published with Oxford University Press. I'm sure you can still pre-buy it on Amazon, so if anyone's interested, check that out. And so maybe to get started, it would be wonderful if you could give us a short overview of the book. Maybe we can talk a little bit about some of its themes and findings. So maybe you could start by telling us what's a game? Why are games art? And what can our game playing activities tell us about our agency?
So the book actually started, so I wasn't supposed to work on this kind of stuff. I was trained as a very ordinary epistemologist, meta-ethicist, and I was working on social epistemology. And I started teaching aesthetics. I was really interested in aesthetics, but I wasn't allowed to, I was genuinely not allowed to work in aesthetics because I was told there weren't any jobs in aesthetics, which is true. And then when I started getting to teach a little aesthetics once I had my job, I started teaching a little stuff about games because I was really interested in games. And I read a bunch of stuff about games, and I started becoming obsessed with the idea that people were entirely missing what was important about games, and what was important about games as an art form, because they were so obsessed with proving that games were an art form that they were trying to assimilate games to art forms that are already known. So a lot of the stuff out there is about how games are an art because they're a fiction, or how games are an art because they do social criticism. And you can actually read piles and piles of stuff about games and see tons of stuff about representation, meaning, story, and characters, and see nothing about skill, choice, difficulty. And I had this thought early on that started as something like, if games are an art form, they're less like fiction and they're more like cities or urban planning. They're like choice spaces for agency. And then this led me down to basically burning the last 5 years of my life on the weirdest possible topic. So the view that the book says is something like this. So it starts off with Bernard Suitz's amazing definition of a game. This is from Suitz's book, Grasshopper, The Grasshopper, which is one of the most marvelous and well-written bits of philosophy. It's actually written as a fake Platonic dialogue between the ant, remember the story of the ant and the grasshopper? The grasshopper is idle and the ant is, works. This is a defense of idleness, and it starts with the grasshopper dying, surrounded by his disciples, and his disciples are all saying let us work for you, let us feed you, and the grasshopper says, no, I would rather die for my commitment to idleness than turn any of you into ants. And so Suitz offers, as part of this book, this definition of a game, and the short version is that games are taking up unnecessary obstacles and temporary goals for the sake of making possible the activity of overcoming them. So in Suitz's view, what you're doing when you play a game is, a game creates a temporary goal, temporary constraints on that goal, and that creates obstacles. And you're doing it not because the goal is important in and of itself, but because reaching the goal under those constraints is important. So one of the main ideas for Suitz is something like, look, we know that making a basket in basketball isn't important in and of itself because you don't go to the court at night with a ladder and pass the ball through the hoop 100 times. That's worthless, right? The activity is only has some worth if it's being done inside the constraint system. So I took that and I thought that there were an incredibly large number of implications for that a lot of people ignored. And in the book, what I spin this out to is a view that looks something like this. Games are unique, not because they can tell stories or because they do political commentary, but they're unique because they're the art form that works in the medium of agency. So the designer, the game designer tells you who you are in the game. The most important thing about the game designer's design is not just the environment of the story, but they sculpt your goal and your abilities. They're sculpting a temporary agent with a temporary set of motivations. And then when you start playing games, what you do is you submerge yourself in a sculpted agency. So this leads to a bunch of interesting, so I thought this was, at the beginning, this was just for me, this thought about, I was obsessed with little aesthetics questions about mediums, and then this led to all this weird stuff. So first of all, we can talk about any of this in detail if you want. First of all, what this tells me is that games are interesting as an art form because the aesthetic qualities emerge not in the game itself, but in your actions. So I'm a rock climber. I think rock climbing is a kind of game. And rock climbs are designed so that you feel elegance in your own body, right? Or chess is designed so you feel brilliance and grace in your own mind. So instead of admiring the aesthetic properties in the artifact that's been made, the artifact gets you to act, and then you admire uh, aesthetic properties in your own action. That's one thing. The other thing that I ended up thinking is that games end up being ways of, so I mean, every art medium is a way of recording something, right? Writing lets us record stories, painting lets us record images, and I think games are actually our way of recording and writing down styles of agency. And you can pick these up from a game. So, I mean, I tell the story in the book, but some people come in analytic philosophy and not good at rigorous thinking. I came up as this like weirdo romantic who was interested in big questions, but was crap at logic. And I actually learned the right mindset for analytic philosophy from playing chess, because chess offers you a narrowed experience where what you're trying to do is hit this very specific target with these very specific abilities, and it pushes you, it forces you into a particular agential mindset, thinking ahead, calculating ahead. So there's this idea, the weird idea that comes out of the end of the book that I think maybe is most interested to the political side of the audience here, is that games are a way to communicate forms of agency. And so actually like the body of games, just like, I mean, I'm really interested in Martha Nussbaum's view that like fiction captures like all kinds of different rich experiences and lets you experience the world from inside a different person's emotional set. And I think games let you experience different sculpted practical styles. One game forces you to like move with your reflex. Another game forces you to think in terms of balance. Another game forces you to think in terms of who's lying. And each of these forces you into a sculpted agency. So games are kind of a library of agency. And I ended up saying the two weirdest places the book goes, and I'll stop after this. The two weirdest places the book goes are, one, Mill has this really interesting passage where he talks about how we need to explore experiments in living, right? So Mill says that we need not just a priori reasoning about what goods are, but we need to live life socially under alternate conceptions of the good. And he was thinking about communes, but I actually think that games do this. They're a rough sketch version of doing this. What a game is especially a momentary, multiplayer games especially doing this, it's a momentary social existence under an alternate conception of the good, where the alternate conception of the good is just whatever the game is telling you is the goal of the game. So I ended up saying that games they're not full, rich life experiences, but they're the quick sketch version of experiments in living. And probably my favorite part of the book, the weirdest part of the book, which has to be my favorite part of the book, there's this puzzle that a lot of people say. There are a lot of people out there in the game space who say something like, look, these games with rules and goals, these are rigid. These aren't the real kind of game. What the really mature kind of game is something where the only kind of game you could learn from is something where you're fully free and fully creative and no one was telling you anything what to do. And I end up being in the really weird position of saying something like, look, games can help you be more free and help develop your autonomy by exposing you to different agential styles and modes over time. And there's a center of the book that basically runs a long analogy between games and yoga, because yoga is a place where, I mean, I think the idea is we naturally have we get into certain postural habits, and yoga gets us out of those by forcing us in short amounts of time into alternate and new postures through very strict directions about how to move. And then we integrate that later on. And my suggestion is something like, games are yoga for your agency, right? For short periods of time, games provide very strict directions for what you're supposed to aim at and the ways you're supposed to think, and you participate in those for a small amount of time, often being forced out of your normal agential style. And then if you can integrate those later, that can help you become more autonomous. So games are soul yoga. That's the book.
Fantastic, thank you. So you've talked a bit about how games shed light on the nature of our agency. And of course, since this is a PPE talk series, another intellectual tradition that will be familiar to a lot of the people here that's said to shed light on the nature of our agency is game theory. And the games that game theorists tend to talk about are explicitly goal-oriented. But you've written a bit about stupid games. Right. So I thought maybe you could tell us a bit about what stupid games tell us about our agency.
So stupid games is actually probably the intellectual center of the book. So this is the best way I can describe the last 5 years of my life is that the best argument I made depends on the existence of drinking games. So to do this, to understand this, we should talk about like kind of the technical heart of the book. So one of the things I think you can get when you look at Suits's definition of a game is the idea that there are two different kinds of play. These are two different motivational states. So I call them achievement play and striving play. So achievement play is playing for the sake of the value of winning, and striving play is playing for the sake of the value of the effort and struggle to win. So another way to put it is, in achievement play, you're playing because you want to win, and in striving play, you temporarily adopt a desire to win in order to experience in order to experience whatever the struggle is. One of the interesting things I find is that for some people, this is totally obvious. They're like, obviously, this striving play. Obviously, you're just doing this for the fun of getting through it. But a lot of people are very doubtful about the existence of striving play at all. This includes two, in particular, a lot of people that hate games. A lot of the reason you want to play games is because you want to win, but winning is stupid, so why would you ever want to play games? And interesting, if you look through the philosophy of sport, a lot of the stuff from the philosophy of sport is strictly about the value of achievement. And one version of this you can see in the Tom Herka into Gwen Bradford line of thinking about games inside perfectionist value theories. Herka and Bradford both think of the value of games in terms of, if not winning, at least like the achievement that you have from doing well. So I needed to defend the existence of this quirky thing called striving play, right? So there are two arguments I have. One is a lot of the times when you play a game, even though you're trying to win in the short term, you're actually modulating your ability to win down in the long term. So my favorite example is my wife and I play a lot of board games. Sometimes we find a new game that's really interesting and we're perfectly even and it's glorious. And then I find a strategy guide at night. And if I read the strategy guide, then I would win all the time. So if I was an achievement player, the only rational thing for me to do is just to read the strategy guide and win, win, win. But I don't read the strategy guide. And the reason I don't read the strategy guide is because I don't actually want to win. What I want to have is interesting struggles. So the interesting game state, the interesting motivational state of playing a game is that you're trying all out to win during the game. But for a lot of us, you're trying to control and reduce your ability to win in the long term in order to keep the struggle interesting, right? That indicates to me that it's striving play. But the other argument I have is consider stupid games. So a stupid game is something where the fun part is failing, but it's only fun if you're actually trying to win. So stupid games are Twister, a lot of drinking games, the children's game of telephone, where you all sit in a circle and you try to pass something, phrase around the circle and it gets garbled completely. My favorite example is Bag on Your Head, which is a game where you get like 20 people in a room and you all put brown paper bags over your head so you can't see. And the goal is to take the bag off of somebody else's head. And if the bag is taken off your head, you lose. And of course, this leads to people like stumbling around into each other, tripping over things. And it's hysterical, right? It's funny. So basically the idea is something like, look, if you're actually trying to fail, it wouldn't be a failure, right? If you're actually trying to fall in Twister, you wouldn't be falling. So you have to aim at not falling because you enjoy falling. And in fact, what you have to do is absorb yourself in the quest. It doesn't have the striking comedy of failure unless you're actually absorbing yourself deeply in the moment in the desire to win, even though you don't care about that. So the interesting structure of striving play is one in which you have a purpose, which is maybe to have fun, and then you have to adopt a local goal. In an important way, you have to forget about your purpose. You have to absorb yourself in a temporary sub-agency. And so I think one of the things this shows us is that we actually have considerably more our agencies are much more fluid than we thought, and we have a lot more temporary control about what absorbs us phenomenally in our goals. And I think we actually do this all the time elsewhere. This is what focus is like elsewhere in the world. If you're interested in the techie side of this, the one thing that's in the Phil Review Games paper that's not in the book is a very technical argument that I had to put, it should have been a different paper, that had to be in this one to prove to people this was real philosophy. And so if any of you back there in practical reasoning, there's a big debate about whether you can desire at will. And the end of the Phil Review paper is an argument about why stupid games demonstrate contra a lot of arguments that you can desire at will, because you are inducing yourself immediately in a desire to win the game, even though you normally don't have that desire, and that desire will disappear at the end of the game. So for you practical reasoning nerds, you might be interested in that.
So I'm sure that this is all very stimulating for a lot of people because, of course, many of us are now confined to our homes, and maybe we're looking at that closet and pulling out those dusty boxes. And now maybe we have an opportunity to do this in a way that, you know, it's consistent with our lives as intellectuals. But maybe T, you could tell us, you know, as we unpack Catan or Clue or whatever we find in that closet, are there any vexing puzzles that we should, you know, try and like interrogate ourselves with as we play? Or are there any puzzles that you weren't able to solve in the course of your work on games that maybe you want to crowdsource to the PPE community here?
Oh my God, yes. I mean, I feel like if you read this thing, I just feel like I was just like stumbling into like undiscovered terrain, and there's just interesting questions. There's actually, the book is full of like, here's an interesting question, so here's some empirical research someone should do. So but there's some big ones that obsess me. I'll save one for later because it'll make sense later, but one of the big ones that obsesses me is, what is play? So I'm fairly satisfied with Suits's account of games. He also offered an account of play, and his account of play, which I don't quite think is right, is reappropriating instrumental uses for autotelic activity. And he thought, interestingly, games and play weren't always the same. So his example was, if you're a professional poker player, you're playing a game, but you're not at play. And if you're playing with your food, you're playing, but you're not playing a game. It doesn't have enough structure. But the two go together a lot. And the book ends with this weird thought where it feels to me like, on the one hand, there's this tension, and this is hinting to what we're going to talk about later. There's this huge tension between institutional forces that force us to simplify our values and like get us to like pick up very narrow, very standardized values that often lose out on a lot of the richness of our valuing activity, and these other things we do. And I have this gut feeling that both art and play are kind of the opposite side of that. So I can give you a little hint of how that works with games. So my theory says something like, look, with games, the danger of games is you might get stuck like that. And the bad effect of games would be if you get into a mode where you expect all values are simple and quantified, and you walk into the world and you expect that again, then that's games giving a bad effect for you. If, on the other hand, you can use games to build a certain kind of fluidity and like get used to diving into a narrowed thing and then stepping back and diving into a completely different narrowed thing and stepping back. So that looks like, to me, I don't know, the beginnings of a habituation effect or a training procedure that might help us resist the force of institutional metrics and value standardization. But there's a larger picture. There's this larger feeling I have that, like, in general, art and play, whatever the hell those things are opposed to forces that are trying to get us to give up whatever our rich values are and simplify our values to whatever the institution thinks they should be. And I don't, that's just a gut feeling. I don't have a good definition of play. I don't have a good explanation of why. You hear this idea, when you read stuff about play, people always hint about ideas like this. Play is the opposite of the corporate. Play is the opposite of institutional. And it seems right to me, but I don't have an argument. So that's one thing that I think I would love to crowdsource an explanation for. Here's another thing. So this striving structure seems to me not to just be in games. I mean, a lot of people say, like, do you think philosophy is a game? And I think one of the answers is philosophy isn't technically a game, but I think what people are reaching for is, for many of us, just a striving activity. Like, who gives a shit what the right answer to a lot of the abstract questions of metaphysics are? That isn't valuable in itself. What's valuable is the kind of activity you go through. So I wrote one other paper after this that tried to just do the beginning of this thought, and that paper is called Autonomy and Aesthetic Engagement. And that paper starts in what seemed to me like a very different question, and that question was, so this old question from aesthetics, which is, why don't we accept expert testimony? There are tons of people who know way more about me than Van Gogh. Why don't I just trust their what their testimony is. If I wanted to be right about Van Gogh, I should just believe what the museum guide says. Like, I don't know shit about art history. Why would I listen to myself? And the answer I suggest in that paper is, it's because art appreciation has the value structure of a game. It has a striving structure, right? What we're trying to do with art appreciation, we're aiming at, our local goal is getting the art right. But the reason we're doing it, our purpose for the activity, is to go through the struggle of interpretation ourselves. And we can tell, because exactly like a game, there's a shortcut. Just like if you're playing an adventure puzzle game, you could look up the answers online. If I'm trying to figure out the value of art, they're experts I could just look at. But the shortcut misses the point. The shortcut misses the point that the point was to be engaged in the activity. So there's one case where I think like kind of deep puzzles about value can be solved by realizing there's this difference between achievement orientations and striving orientations. And my gut says that's everywhere, and that there are lots of other activities that we might be misunderstanding because we're trying to, I mean, to me, it looks like, if you look at a lot of the previous work in philosophy of games, it looks like our motivational structure is kind of perverted by the attempt to understand all of it in this like a straightforward achievement structure, where the goal at which you aim, the product at which you're trying to create, is also the thing that's valuable. So I think, I mean, I kind of think the big way to say this is I think philosophy has spent a lot of time thinking about moral life and very little time thinking about play life. And play life is much more like this. So I wonder what else out there, what else of our activities has philosophy misunderstood because they're trying to force a striving activity into an achievement value model.
I wanted to ask you a question about value capture, which is a
Right.
concept that you touched upon a moment earlier, and that I think will be of interest, all our peak years. So in a new project, you write, numbers reshape our values. They redirect how we find meaning in our lives. And the technology highlights those numbers and hard codes them into the basic infrastructure of our environment. It's hard to wear a Fitbit and not start to care about step counts. It's even harder to go on Twitter and not care about getting retweets. And it's hard, I might add, since a few of my students are listening, to take a philosophy class and not care about one's grades. So I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about integrating metrics of value and the technologies that subject our daily activities to those metrics, and how that might stand to alter our existing values and how it might stand to transform personal decision making.
Yep. Okay, so this is something that happens in the very last chapter of the book. I just introduced this idea, and right now I'm actually trying to work on a popular book about this. And so the idea that I introduced at the end of, I started thinking at the end of the book about gamification, because most people out there seem to think something like, well, games are good, so gamification should be good. And I kind of think if you understand why games are good, you'll see why things like the gamification of education are totally terrible. So I offer you this notion called value capture. So value capture is any case where your natural values are rich and subtle and maybe a little inchoate, and then you get put into a social setting, often an institutional setting, that offers you simplified, often quantified versions of those values, and then those simplified, quantified versions take over in your practical reasoning and your deliberation, and then things go bad. So some examples are, one, you put on a Fitbit and you start exercising for health, and instead you start to come to care about maximizing step counts. Another one, you go into philosophy for the love of wisdom, and you come out of graduate school obsessed with your citation rates and what school you'll get into and its placement on a certain ranked list. Or, and I think this is the most dangerous one for me, you go on Twitter for the love of discourse, and you come out caring about retweet numbers, follower counts, likes. I think that one of the reasons, so there are a number of reasons why this might happen to us, but one I think the game story gives us is that games are pleasurable because they offer us this incredible experience of like value clarity. So I think in normal life, like life is terrible in a lot of ways, and one of the ways life is terrible is that our values they're plural, they're hard to judge, they're often incommensurable. We're often like hit by this like horror of trying to navigate this world where there are 1,000 conflicting values. And then game life offers us value simplified, right? It offers us a world where we know exactly what we're doing, we know exactly what everyone else is doing, we know exactly what we're allowed to do to get there, and we know exactly how well we've done in clear and inarguable terms. So I think this is kind of like, I don't know, maybe it's romantic, but in the book, I call this like an existential balm. Like for a moment, we were like, we have relief from like the horror, the overwhelmingness of value life. Um, and it's okay in a game because games are temporary alternate structures where you pursue artificial temporary ends that are not attached to normal ends. So it's okay to adopt these narrow ends. Now, if you gamify life, what you need to do is, in order to increase motivation and make things more pleasurable, you need to hyper simplify the target value. You need to change something like from wellness to step counts. You need to change from wisdom to citation rates. And I mean, I think it's obvious to everyone that these are not the same thing, right? So the worry for me about a lot of this stuff, is that, in fact, a lot of metrified value systems, they call to us to take them up and replace our value systems with them. And they give us an enormous amount of pleasure in exchange. But what they ask us to do is hyper simplify our value systems. And I think that's what gamification is, and accidental gamification, like being stuck in a system with metrics. This, by the way, leads me to my other open question that is the hardest question for me that I would love to get help on. It seems so clear to me personally that the values we should have shouldn't be these hyper-simplified, hyper-metrified institutional values. That the plain, explicit, and easily measurable stuff like Fitbit and citation rates and Twitter retweets could not possibly serve in our lives as our standard, fuller values do. I don't have an argument for this. It just seems obvious. And what I've been like beating my head up for is looking for an argument about why, in particular, the institutional process of explication of values and the standardization of values so that they can transmit easily in a large-scale institution, why that tends to yield things that are crappy for us to live with. That's my biggest open question.
Thank you. So you characterize technologies that subject daily life to evaluative metrics as technologies of narrow-mindedness. And I was thinking, so in some work from the late 90s, Dave Chalmers and Andy Clark write about the extended mind, right? About the ways in which notepads and I guess today iPhones might just become functional components of our minded selves. And in doing so, Clark and Chalmers tend to characterize these things as neutral or harmless prosthetics, as effective extensions of us, of our existing desires and attitudes. I think the possibility that you're highlighting when you talk about technologies of narrow-mindedness is interesting because it posits that the prosthesis acts on the operator. So that in effect, when we engage with things like activity monitoring apps like Fitbit, they subvert and transform our agency, our goals, our values, our attitudes and activities. So normally, extending the mind is addressed in character neutral terms. Can we now evaluate the extended mind thesis in richer terms, in terms of the extended character or the extended persona? And could we even talk about extended mental discord as well?
Yeah, so this is, I love your way of framing this. I might steal some of this and footnote you because this is, this is actually what this is exactly the thought that a lot of extended mind literature is talking about something just like pure cognitive processing power. And I'm thinking about something else. I'm thinking about the fact that we might do extended valuing, that we might let other things into our process of figuring out what our values are, or even offload just the designation of our values to certain pre-coded objects. So I don't think all extended valuing is bad. Actually, there's this weird paper I wrote that tried to figure out how public art objects might count as like group values because they like encoded emotions into something out there. And I think one of the things about the best case public artworks is they arise from community discourse. Everyone's involved in figuring out what they are and what they should say, at least in the ideal case. But I get really worried about the cases in which someone is offering you something like a Fitbit or the Twitter interface that offers a sticky thing that might take over in your values in which you had no role in forming, right? So there's another paper I wrote, by the way, hopefully, maybe you can tell me if I'm insane or not. I think all the stuff that I've been working on actually coheres and other people don't, but there's this other paper I wrote called Trust as an Unquestioning Attitude. And that paper was about how we don't just trust people, we trust objects. And the idea I floated there was that what it was to trust something was to try to integrate it into your agency. So a lot of the literature on trust says like, look, you can only trust, in the heightened normative sense, you can only trust other agents because you can only be betrayed by other agents. You can never be betrayed by non-agential processes or objects. And I ended up thinking like, look, actually a lot of the key paradigmatic cases of betrayal aren't by other agents. Feeling betrayed by your memory when it starts to fail you, feeling betrayed by your hands when they don't respond properly. And so the suggestion I had, looking at like a lot of people's like emotional responses to technology going wrong, what we're trying to do is a lot of times we're trying to integrate technological objects into our agency. But a lot of the times it's not just processing power. What we're integrating is a value system that's hard coded. So the suggestion is, it's not that the Fitbit definitely takes over your value, but it's offering you an opportunity to integrate it in and replace your valuing with it, right? You could plug it in if you wanted. And so I've been trying to figure out, so my gut says that this is an enormous harm to ourselves as self-determining autonomous beings. One of the interesting things for me is, under certain simplified notions of autonomy, it looks fine because look, ruling yourself with Fitbit is a decision you made yourself, right? Ruling yourself with citation rates is a decision you made yourself. And so what the current formulation that I'm working with, and this is just what I've been thinking about for the last, basically in quarantine, is that the problem is that you're outsourcing the process of settling on your own values, right? I'm glad that you're nodding because it makes me feel slightly less crazy because this is like the first time I'm saying this in public. Does that make sense? Like what we should be doing, it feels to me like, is it's not that our values come from nowhere, but when we live life under our values, we should be listening to experience and fine-tuning our values and changing them. Another way to put it is like, you should at least tailor your values to yourself. And a lot of this stuff offers you, basically lets you buy your values off the rack and makes them like not tinkerable with. Does that make sense? So that's the thought, and that's exactly a thought about extended agency and extended valuing.
So let's move from individual agency to political culture. Okay, here's a contentious question. If the leaders of a political party were obsessed with the outcomes of opinion polls or TV ratings or short-term shifts in the stock market, could that be an instance of gamification in the terms that you've been describing it? And what would it mean for our politics to become gamified?
So technically, I'm going to call it value capture instead of gamification, because gamification is now a term of art and it means to places where people have explicitly used game design principles. But I think this is something, it's part of a larger school of things that's happening where there are simple, clear rankings and metrics and we're drawn into them. I think in a lot of cases, what we see, so of course, if the metric is a completely inaccurate one, being drawn to it will be bad. But I think in a lot of cases, even if it's sort of accurate, there's something that's really terrible that happens when, especially in a political process, a wide number of actors converge on a number of prefabricated, simplified metrics. And when I think about, so I haven't thought about the rest of the stuff you're talking about. I've mostly been thinking about Twitter. And it does seem like right now, political discourse on Twitter has been gamified and value captured as people seem to be motivated to pursue large numbers of retweets. What's going to happen? So I think there's a really good analogy. So there's a really good book that I would highly recommend to anyone in philosophy, especially in PPE, called Engines of Anxiety by Wendy Esplin and Michael Sauter. They're two sociologists, and it's the document of their 10-year study of what happened to law schools and legal education when the US News and World Report rankings started getting published. And what they say is, before the US News and World Report, different schools had different missions. So one school might have the mission of, just being fancy, and another school might have the mission of letting in underprivileged students, and another school might have the mission of trying to find progressive activists and train them as and students would do this process where they'd look at these missions and think and talk about what the schools were good at and then figure out what fit them. So one, there was value diversity in the schools, and two, there's a process of like self-determination among the students. And now the rankings have come, and two things. One, students don't seem to care about anything but the place in rankings, right? That seems to have obliterated the decision process for them. And two, what Wendy Esplin and Michael Sauter report is that schools have stopped pursuing variant missions, because if you pursue any mission that is skew with the US News and World Report, you immediately drop in the rankings, because the rankings are looking at very specific things like LSATs and GPAs. and then you lose funding and you lose students. And so what's happening is this like kind of ironing out of a vast, rich value landscape, replacing with one, not, I mean, the inaccuracy and simplicity is one problem, but the monolithicness, I think, is another significant problem. And I'm very worried about that. There's another version of this I'm worried about what will happen to our art life if we get drawn to, say, whatever gets the most hours on Netflix, which is also a thing that's happening. We can talk about it later. But does that make sense?
Absolutely, thank you. So we've only got time for a couple more. Maybe we can move to some other work of yours. So yeah. Political discourse is increasingly online, perhaps more so now that we're all inside than ever. And you've written about the distinction between epistemic bubbles and echo chambers. And perhaps you could talk a little bit more about this distinction, about what these terms mean, and about why echo chambers represent a threat to political culture, and what can be done to reduce their influence on their members.
Yeah. So, this paper started, the echo chambers and epistemic bubbles paper started because I was reading a lot of sociology, especially Cass Sunstein's political theory. And I started noticing as people are talking about, oh, we're all in a filter bubble, we're all in an echo chamber, what looked to me like gross conceptual error between two different categories. So people tend to use the term filter bubble or epistemic bubble as a synonym for this term echo chamber. And lately there's actually been a lot of work that's saying there are no such things. But if you actually look at the original text that introduced these concepts, they're totally different. So a filter bubble is supposed to be something like, you're on Facebook, you're liberal, all your friends are liberal, you never hear arguments from the other side. By the way, it's starting to look like there are very few filter bubbles. Most people are actually aware of the arguments on the other side. So people are using that term synonymously with the term echo chamber. If you look at where the term echo chamber is introduced, which is from some sociologists and journalism professors in a book called Echo Chamber, they define an echo chamber as a structure where everyone on the inside is brought to distrust everyone on the outside. And that seems conceptually entirely different. Does that make sense? So one structure is a structure, a filter bubble is a structure where you're not exposed to arguments on the other side. And an echo chamber is a structure where you don't trust people on the other side. And I think actually most people have been worried that what's going on is a filter bubble, but we have plenty of evidence that it's not, right? Climate change denialists know the arguments from the other side. What they think is that university science has been systematically corrupted by some kind of elite Illuminati, right? That is an echo chamber. And crucially, so people like Cass Sunstein, who treat the problem as a filter bubble, think that the way you break it is just to expose people to the other side. But if you've been already taught to distrust people on the other side, then those exposures are at best useless. What you actually need to do is repair trust. So the outcome of the echo chamber stuff is what we need to do is systematically repair manipulated trust. If you ask me how to do that, I have no idea at all, especially not on a public policy level. This stuff actually links up to the game stuff for me, and maybe the connection is, I mean, obviously the place it links up is in the world. It seems like echo chambers form really well on Twitter, and so there seems to be like there's some possible connection between the gamification of Twitter and the formation of echo chambers. And the way I'm thinking about it right now is they're both forms of what I want to call instrumentalization. So instrumentalization is when some activity has a natural target, and then you shift that target for some other reason. A lot of the instrumentalizations I'm thinking about are the reasons something like comfort or security. So gamification makes things more fun and pleasurable by changing the aim of conversational discourse. And in an echo chamber, who you trust, which was supposed to aim at the trustworthy, has been altered systematically so that you only trust insiders and you don't trust outsiders. And this has a lot of pleasures associated with it, right? The pleasures of feeling secure, the pleasures of absolute certainty. So I think there's some weird link between the gamification stuff and the echo chamber stuff that I'm working on right now.
That's very interesting. Thank you. So to close our conversation before we move to questions, I wanted to ask you whether you could recommend any games to us.
Awesome.
What are some of your favorites and why?
So let me give you a few amazing games you should try. By the way, I think Catan is a terrible game. And the reason people, sorry, I shouldn't say this, but Monopoly is boring, and I think Catan is boring in a similar way to Monopoly. And so people kind of recognize, people probably like Catan in this room. There are a lot of amazing games out there right now. And one truly amazing game is called Imperial. So Imperial is a fantastic illustration of how complex and dense modern games can get with very subtle rules. Imperial looks like Risk. It looks like combat between, it's World War I. There are 6 forces out there. All the nations can build factories, that can build armies, can fight each other. But you don't play the nations. You play the shadowy Swiss bankers that trade investments in the nations, and you temporarily control any nation that you have the greatest number of investments in. But the goal is not for your country to win. The goal is to come out with the most money. And so it becomes this complex 2-layer game about manipulating investments and co-investments and trying to incentivize people to do various things by offering them cheap stock and then destroying the world economy for the sake of your own money. It's truly evil, but the gameplay is fascinating. For all you intellectuals out here, the #1 board game to play is Root. It's called, the subtitle is Root, a woodland game of might and right. So the most interesting board game designer right now, I think, is Cole Whale, who designed Root. And Root is an asymmetric game where each of you plays a different force. And it's based in this really interesting set of games called the coin game. So the coin games were a bunch of asymmetric war games based on wars of counterinsurgency. So one was like the US versus Afghanistan versus the Taliban. Another one was Vietnam. It's like the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army and the US and the South Vietnamese army. And each side had totally different rules. These were incredibly complex games. Like, I think the rule books were like 50 pages long. It took 4 players to play, and they were like 8-hour games. And Cole Whale did a few things. First, he thought the asymmetry and the political aspect were incredibly interesting, but he thought it could be simplified. So he's boiled it down to an easy-to-learn game that takes an hour. The second thing was he thought that all of the mechanics of the coin games were ultra right-wing and ultra warhawk. And he, in fact, was a history graduate student specializing in Foucaultian biopolitics. And if you go online, you can find his desire diary in a post in which he talks about trying to build in his views about Foucault on biopower into this game. And the way the game works is one of you plays the Marquise de Cats, who is a fat cat industrialist, whose game is building resources and building a network. And another of you actually plays the Woodland Alliance, who are a bunch of underground rebels, and they have a completely different game where they're trying to spread sympathy and pop up. But whenever they get pop up, they're really vulnerable. But when someone else stamps on them and kills them, they get a bunch of sympathy, and it makes them easier for them to pop up. And they're trying to disrupt the network of the industrialist. And another faction is the Erie, who are a bunch of warhawks, who are incredibly powerful but incredibly dogmatic. And at the beginning of the game, you have to set this elaborate plan that you build. And so the other players get like 2 to 3 moves. But the Erie gets like 5, 8, 10 moves each turn. But they can only execute their entire plan that they wrote earlier. And if they don't, they fall into chaos. So they're like hyper dogmatic. And then another one of you plays an arms trader who's trying to benefit from the war by selling your cards to the highest bidder. And it's, if you want to see the potential for actually, I mean, and this game is a game for me about agency switching, because each of these different roles has a completely different way of thinking about the game. And then when you switch roles, you get to see the mesh. There's tons more I could talk about, but maybe I should stop there.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is we've got about 20 minutes for questions, and I'm going to transfer the microphone over to my able colleague, Dr. Ryan Doody.
Turn my camera on. Well, I can't, so I will just be a disembodied voice. All right, so let me start with a really simple question that came up, which is that you mentioned this book about law school and university. And could you say what the name of that book was and the authors again?
Right, so the name of the book was Engines of Anxiety by Wendy Esplund and Michael Sauter. But I just want to take this opportunity to tell people to read a few other books from this space that philosophers should be reading. I wanted to talk about this, and I didn't find a chance. So there's this incredibly rich world in sociology and anthropology and history about quantification culture. And I think especially people in PPE should be reading this, and it's shocking to me that people in philosophy aren't reading this. One of the most important books is Theodore Porter's Trust in Numbers. And in Trust in Numbers, what Theodore Porter says is that there are two kinds of knowing, qualitative and quantitative. And qualitative ways of knowing are rich and subtle, but very context dependent and very hard to communicate across contexts. And quantitative ways of knowing are simplified and stripped down, but are easy to aggregate and easy to transmit. So here's this amazing example of the hide. The hide used to be an old measure of land, and a hide was the amount of land required to feed an average family. And of course, a hide varies wildly in size, depending on whether you're near a river or a desert. But that can't be managed from the periphery. So when we move to centralized governments, what we get is the acre, which is functionally insensitive, but manageable from the center, but it loses all this information. For people in education, what you should be thinking about now is GPA. Just like imagine for a moment a world in which we didn't have to quantify grades and you just give students direct evaluative feedback based on their own goals and personalities. But instead we do this thing where we create a GPA, and the GPA is hyper simplified. It strips out most of the important information, but it's transmittable across context and aggregatable. So that's Trust in Numbers. And the other thing you should read is James Scott's Seeing Like a State, which says basically, which extends this idea and basically says, governments and corporations and large-scale institutions they can only think in terms of standardized measures, usually quantities, and they have a reason to remake the world to make it simpler for them to process in quantified terms. And this just seems to me like something like political philosophers should be all over, and we don't read it.
That sounds fantastic. All right, so I'm going to ask you a couple questions about games. I'm going to kind of mush together a couple questions that that are on the same topic. So at the beginning, you were talking about playing games as a way of sort of practicing agency. And here are kind of two questions. One is from Isaac and one is from Fabian that are coming at the same thing, but from two different points of view. So one is, do you think that some game styles are better than others for this goal? So like, are multiplayer games better than single player games for practicing agency? Do you think games that are like strategic games or games that involve mental stimulation over games that involve reflex and skill, are those better for the sort of practicing of agency? And then similarly, Fabian was asking that it seems like lots of people maybe play games for other sorts of reasons than just to practice agency, like just to have a nice time with your friends, or to be sociable, or to or maybe just really competitive and you enjoy the feeling of winning. Are those sorts of motives supposed to be a part of practicing agency, or are those separate things and separate reasons one might find valuable about games?
Right. So first, let me take that second question first, because it's a little more straightforward. First of all, I want to be a hyper pluralist about games. One of the important things to me is that the most important insight about games is a lot of players have a striving structure where that value could be anything. So I think there are all kinds of things we can do. Second, one of the important things is, I think if what you're doing is practicing agency, you don't need to intend it or know that you're doing it to do it. Like, I think that a lot of, I mean, this is true in the other arts too. I think a lot of people read Vonnegut because he's funny, and then all this philosophical insight like creeps into you. And the fact that you're playing to win or for pleasure, none of these prevent the fact that you are entering into another agency and practicing it. So the first question I think is much more complex. So on the one hand, so one way to answer the question is to say that some games have much more complex agential forms in them where you have to do some agency switching inside the game itself. I think about Go, so I'm a Go player. And one of the things about Go is you often have to switch between very narrow particular states of minds where you're focusing on a particular battle versus very broad strategic thinking. But I don't think actually that's the most interesting answer. I think the most interesting answer is, I suspect that there's not a game in particular that's better at practicing, makes you better at practicing agency. Each game offers you some agency. And the thing that actually makes you better at it is the variety. here's another way to put it. I think some people want to react to this stuff by saying, oh, then we should have games that have as many agencies in them as possible, and as rich and subtle agencies where we do as much fluidity. And I think actually, if you buy the yoga analogy seriously, one of the things that makes it easier to find your way in to a very different alternate agency is how specific and narrow it is in the game, right? How rigid it is, and how rigid the rules are. So my suspicion is actually the narrowness of games is always good for learning a specific agency, and then moving between many games is a way to get variety, to get this and I think this is actually what we do in normal life is we have to switch between different, I mean, I talk about this a little bit in the book. Like my university life, sometimes I'm thinking like an analytic philosopher and doing like the chess asshole thing. Sometimes I'm a teacher and I have to be thinking about communication. Sometimes suddenly I think I'm a teacher, but in fact, I'm the advisor for someone that's having a mental breakdown and I have to be empathetic. And sometimes in the middle of administration buildings, I have to be a conniving, manipulative, Machiavellian asshole so the business school doesn't defund the philosophy department completely while we're not looking. Real story. So it seems like what we need is to have this variety. And so if you do a lot of games, this is the idealistic vision, then you're practicing and you're building out your toolbox that you can move between.
All right, so here's two other questions that are on a similar topic that I'm going to ask together. One is by Jeff and one is by Parker. So it was about the part when you were talking about adopting values off the rack versus, sort of interrogating values and tailoring them to ourselves. So Jeff was wondering, are there sort of standards involved when we're tailoring values to ourselves? And if so, like, what are those standards? And is there a risk of that process being corrupting in some way? And Parker's question was, you might think that there's something good about just adopting values off the rack, or something understandable about that, especially for people who are occupied with other things, who are too tired from doing other things that they have to do, and don't have the time and energy left at the end of the day to be interrogating all their values. You might think that this sort of gamification or simplifying values would be really desirable.
These are the deep questions I'm wrestling with right now. So the first thing I should say is I don't have a good answer. And part of the problem is underneath this is a question about why it might be better to have certain values than others and why certain values might be poor to have. So I can give you a limited answer here. So I've been really taken lately with this view from Elijah Milgram that shows up in his paper on boredom, which is wonderful, but is present in its clearest form in a book called Practical Induction. And his view is something like, look, you can't just deduce your values from the top down. Your values have to fit you, your place in life, and your personality. And one of the things that you do is you try out values experimentally, and then you shift them when your life doesn't work. And one of the things he suggests in the early book is that when your life is unpleasurable, that's a sign that your values are poor ones for you. And in the later work, he suggests that when you're deeply bored, I think he gets a lot of this from Nietzsche and also I think Mill's stuff on experiments in living. I'm not sure exactly, but I think there's something right about that. And the best thing I can say is, one of the things, if you read a lot of the culture of quantification literature, what you end up seeing is what those values were made for. So one thing you could say right here immediately is just, look, purely, you should be autonomous and determine your values for yourself. But I think there's another thing, a subtler thing to say, which is your values, the way you articulate them, should fit you and your personality. If anything should, that's what should. And the values that emerge from large-scale institutions were not typically designed with your health and well-being in mind, right? What they're typically designed for, at least from the stuff I've seen, is easy measurability, easy justification within an institutional context, easy manipulation. I mean, the problem with the GPA is everyone knows that GPAs don't transmit most of what's educationally valuable, but all the attempts to transmit what's educationally valuable don't aggregate easily on a spreadsheet for an administration officer. So one way to put it is, if you accept the premise that that values can be changed and some articulations of value are better or worse than others, then you should think that the values that you find embedded in metrics and measures in the technologies and institutions that surround us were not made with our best well-being and psychological health in mind. I mean, that's the best I have so far. But those are exactly the right questions. Those are the deep questions.
All right, so now we have switching gears a little bit. Here's a question about filter bubbles and echo chambers. So you said that they invite very different responses and that you have no idea how to overcome echo chambers. But do you think that there are some, like, what are some suggestions that have been put out there of ways that we might overcome echo chambers that you don't think work?
Right. So, I mean, the problem is that most of the suggestions out there are aimed at filter bubbles and not echo chambers. So most of the suggestions you see are premised on the view that, one, people don't hear the other side. Two, simply exposing them to the data will improve things. And three, so what we should do is build either vast public forums or increase education so people hear what the other side says. And I mean, when I was writing this stuff, I made myself every morning read like Breitbart comment sections for 10 minutes. And everyone on Breitbart knows exactly what liberals think, can rehearse the arguments in a moment, right? What they have is massive unsympathy and distrust and complex stories about how the other side is actually part of a conspiracy out to get them. One of the interesting things here is, so Andre Begbe has this interesting paper called Evidential Preemption, and he says that we can do this interesting thing where, let's say that I'm Rush Limbaugh and you are all my followers, and I say, those people out there, they're going to come at you and tell you that I'm lying. I'm going to make some predictions about the nasty things that other people say about me. And when you, my followers, go out there, you'll see those predictions come true, which A, that's been preempted because I've given you some preemptive reason to discard it, and B, just increases your confidence level in me. So one of the worries is something like, if you believe the problem was just a filter bubble, then you would think mere exposure works. If, on the other hand, you think what Andre and I think, which is things like conspiracy theories are actually preemptive traps, so that when you're simply exposed blankly to what the other side thinks, it just fulfills your conspiracy theory, that's actually going to make things worse. So those things don't look to me like they'll work. If you actually look at stories of how people leave cults and how people leave white supremacist sites and how people get pulled out of the KKK, it always looks like something like they built a long-term relationship and built a relationship of trust, and then they saw that the conspiracy theories they believed couldn't be true of this human being. So that, there are stories of that working on an individual level. The thing I don't know how to do is to build public policy to repair trust on a systematic level when it's been manipulated in the long term.
Great. So thank you very much to everyone for those fantastic questions. And thank you very much to our guest, Thi, for a really stimulating and exciting conversation, and for wonderful game recommendations, and for lots of food for thought, and for some very generous, like intellectually generous offers of questions for us to work on as we sit in our homes and contemplate the contents of our game cupboards. So I'm just going to do a little plug for next week's talk now. So if you join us here in this very room at the same time next week, on Friday at 3 p.m., we're going to be talking about research, expertise, and existential risk.